So what do you do if you won't get a permit for a carport? You build a garage pergola. The project started with a lot of digging, for the site where we wanted the pergola wasn't really square, and then we didn't want it to be too narrow like the old garage tent that we've been using for the last decade. Considering how much stone and roots there were in that hill, I probably should have rented a digger. But I'm a cheapskate, so I did it all with hand tools. At least I got a good workout from it. The kids helped some, pretending it was Minecraft, and they actually were a bit disappointed when it was done. They would have happily continued until the entire slope was leveled. Now I just have to find a use for all these stones. I think we removed about a dozen wheelbarrows. Luckily, we had another slope that needed some dirt for a future project. With the site cleaned, it was time for more digging. This time for the post holes. I felt I had my fill of digging and tried to keep them as slim as possible, but that also meant that the shovel head was too big, especially since the holes were supposed to be 70 centimeters deep. So I made myself a digging ladle to scoop out the loose dirt. There's a separate video on that, link in the description when you're done with this one. But to summarize, I made it from an old laughing gas canister. It might look weird, but it works for my purposes. Instead of using pre-made plinths, we opted to cast them in place using cardboard tubes. They come in 120 cm lengths, so you normally cut them in half to get the right length. Some gravel in the bottom for drainage, and then it's just the tedious work of getting them level. The lower side posts were in the flower bed where it was just dirt and stone, but the top side was either sand or hard clay, so the digging bar was definitely the MVP of the operation, with my ladle as a close second. It made me feel like the primitive technology guys, even though I wasn't digging out an entire mansion with a swimming pool in the basement. For the topmost corner post, I had to work it into the slope, so it was twice as long as the other ones, with the top half sticking out of the ground. I'll cover it up in the future when we do more of the fine planning of the groundworks, but for now it can be partly visible. I was pretty lucky with the weather during the build, but as soon as I started with the concrete, the rain came. But at least the molds didn't dry out too fast, so maybe it was lucky after all. At least I was glad I had an old garage tent to work in, so I didn't get more soaked than needed. I used an old buzz saw to vibrate the concrete in the form and pushed down 2 pieces of 8mm rebar for added strength. To fixate the post holders, I had them screwed to some scrap pieces of 2x4 and balanced it on a piece of MDF. I vibrated the holders to make the concrete flow around them, and then obsessed about them being level in all directions until the concrete started to cure. My dad has his own woods and chainsaw mill, and since he also doesn't like waste, he has more milled wood stored than he will ever need. So I helped him by taking a fraction of his hands, like the good son I am. It was a bit of a drive and took a couple of trips to get all the wood needed, but you can't beat free. Back on site, the post holders are fully cured and they came out decent enough. I had to do some fine adjustment, but that was just to be expected. Now it was just a matter of cutting the wood to size, making some final decisions about the look of the pergola. We hadn't really decided on the height since the ground was sloped, and it can be hard to visualize how big things are in real life. I just knew I wanted it to be tall enough so I could walk under it without me banging my head. Since the plinths were set out of the ground, they were at slightly different heights, so I had to cut the pillars individually, which took a lot of measuring, cutting and testing, and all over again. The pillars themselves are made out of 2x4 sandwiched between 2 1x5s. Okay, that was a lot of numbers, but I think you get it. This way the holders are partly hidden and the pillars can stand on their own, at least long enough to fasten them temporarily. Here's an example of me trying to find the correct height of the small corner pillar. It's the same as the big ones, just easier to move around. Like a glove. I painted the underside beforehand, but waited with the rest because it felt easier to do that with them in place. The complete opposite of the underside, that is. The joists, or whatever you call them, are made in 2 pieces. Partly because my dad didn't have any 6+ meters long 2x6s, and partly because I wouldn't have been able to lift them if they were one piece. The ends were partly trimmed for both aesthetics and to help with rainwater. At least I think so. I cut some custom tar paper to prevent moisture from traveling up into the wood. I hope I made a decent job of it. If only there had been 4 of me. because each joist segment weighed 14 kilos, and that proved a bit much to lift over my head and try to fit it into the 2 slots. But I got it there in the end. The middle was connected with a nail plate, or whatever it's called in English, and a reasonable amount of screws. And just to be sure, I added a strength of 2 12cm screws as well, one from the top and one from the bottom. As to not have the screws colliding in the middle of the 2x4s, those were just 5cm long, but chunky ones like that should be pretty strong. And then we just rinse and repeat on the other side. But this time it was a bit harder, for that side is a bit taller, so it was more of a struggle to get the last piece up there. On this side the 2 parts didn't go together as smoothly as the first, so we added a small strip of wood to hide the gap, which also made the transition between the joists more even. Shh, don't tell anyone. Each overlapping part of the pillars got attached to the joist with 4 screws from each side, which gave the structure lengthwise stability. And the 2 boards connecting the sides together both stabilized and squared up the structure. I do love Torx bits, but it's quite annoying how often they get trapped in the screw heads. We decided to paint the nail plates black so they would blend in more with the wood. I know it doesn't look like that now, but just wait until everything is painted. Painting, yeah, that was the least fun part of this project. I complained on Instagram how long it would take me to paint all the top boards, and then Chloe from DIY by Chloe commented that I should get a paint sprayer for my compressor. At which point I remembered that I have a paint sprayer. But at that point I'd already painted more than half of the structure and didn't feel like changing the workflow. But the next time I build a huge pergola, I'm definitely bringing out the paint sprayer. I made these triangles to support the top boards and give them a nice 45-degree angle, because we didn't want the boards standing upright. To make sure that they were evenly spaced, I made these spacers to space them out. That was perhaps a bit too much space for one sentence. I fixated the triangles in place beforehand to make the placing the boards easier. And yeah, I broke that drill bit, but it was the only tool casualty of this project. Slippery! For the front side we wanted a trellis to give the garden bed some height support, so I used offcuts from the pillar boards. Unfortunately, the screws I bought were just a bit too long, so to save me a trip to the store, I cut the tips off. Maybe save doesn't really belong in that sentence. I had to clamp every intersection of the trellis, which was a bit of a hassle, but these cheap spring clamps really came handy. The top boards were over 4 meters long, so it wasn't that fun to juggle them. But it was really nice to see them finally in place. 2 screws on each side meant a lot of climbing up and down, and to be able to reach I had to do them one at a time and then move the next into position. I made these yardsticks to make sure that the boards were sticking out uniformly towards the house. The ugly side is facing the woods, and no one is supposed to see it from there. The thing with a pergola is that it has to be at least 50% see-through, so that's why the boards are spaced as they are. And we don't need a roof over our car. Considering how seldom we wash it, a bit of rain will just do it good. What we need is shade. In the summertime to keep the heat out, and in the winter to protect the windows from the frozen gaze of space, and by that keeping the ice free. Hopefully the boards will be enough to accomplish that. From one view they are see-through, and from the other side they are not. And no, the sun won't shine from the open side. The house is shading the pergola from that part of the day. There were some old wines that never wanted to climb on the garage tent that seemed really happy to have a proper trellis to work with. Ah, so much space. Now we can open the doors on both sides without smacking into the sides. Here's a time lapse showing the sun's movement. It's not perfect coverage by any means, but hopefully it's enough, and it looks much better than the old garage tent. A proper summer build. That's the definition of a good vacation. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice whatever you're having.